Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Lankford of Oklahoma.
Thank you. And thanks, y'all, for coming. We talked earlier today about incentives for agencies to try to look for duplicate waste. Obviously, everyone wants to have more staff, wants to do more things, wants to engage it, and everyone sees the problems. They want to help solve it. What incentives specifically do you see that you think, okay, this is an incentive to help? Because honestly, I've talked with several people that are Federal workers. They see it as well. They see the waste around them. They say, I can't believe we fill out this form. I can't believe we do this. Someone else does this. They see it. How do we create incentives within that agency to that specific employee to say, when you see it, here's a way to be able to help us get out of it?
Well, I'll give you a couple examples. When I was head of the county government in Fairfax, I went to my agency heads in a budget time and asked them to cut their budget, and they came up with nothing. When we said, look, of what you can find, you can spend some of this your own way within certain guidelines. Right. They came up with a lot more.
Right.
Who's interested in cutting their budget if it's going to go to somebody that overspent their budget, or if it's going to, quote, a deficit? It's just not in the nature of the way things work. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing is we could bring agencies us and ask them to take certain lines of businesses and look for ways to shared savings and report back. Just if it's just 2 or 3 lines of business per agency. Where right now they are stovepipe, but they could work together. I mean, the best example of that is the health records between VA and DOD. There's no reason you have to do the same, different sets of health records.
Right.
Now, I'll give you one other that affects the State, if I can just take a second. Right now, for State governments, are spending a lot of money on just being able to authenticate their communications with the Federal Government. Security standards exist for States to authenticate users to access data in federally funded systems that are hosted by the State. But each Federal agency interprets the standards differently, so States have to meet each Federal agency standards, replicating a different process to various programs. That costs a lot of money. So Social Security uses technology for verification. Department of Justice will use a certain procedures and protocols on that. So they are having to do different things. You ought to have one standard across the board for these kinds of things.
Okay, that's terrific. Mr. Darrow, you want to mention that as well?
I think Mr. Davis talked about within each agency, and I do agree with his suggestions in terms of forcing people to come up with recommendations. But many things that we point out in our report are multiple agencies involved in the same area. And we believe the only way this is going to get solved is by high-level attention within the administration. OMB needs to play a very critical role in this whole endeavor, and the Congress does as well, to provide the right type of incentives there. For example, one of the areas, it's not mentioned in here, but we're going to work on it, it's on our high-risk list, is modernizing disability programs. There's about 200 different disability programs. And because of our insistence in working with OMB on the high-risk set of meetings I talked about before, we brought together all the agencies involved in that process. It was one of the first times they've ever met to be able to discuss that. So I think there's ways to build in incentives and deal with disincentives. Another area that we've recommended before is leasing versus buying. There's a you know, a sort of a bias in the rules toward scoring that differently. We've recommended that be changed as well.
Let me ask you a specific question as well, Mr. Darrow. You had mentioned about the contracting vehicles, and you're recommending fewer contracting. Have you compiled a list of contracting vehicles you say these should be seriously looked at?
Yeah, these are contracts that are interagency contracts, and what we've said is there's really not a list. The list ought to be compiled by the executive branch. It ought to be made visible, and people should make sure that they know.
So right now, I know we have a multitude of different contracts and systems of contract for procurement. You don't have, at this point, a list to say, here are the different contracting vehicles we think are inherently inefficient.
We have the types of vehicles that are inefficient or impose more risk to the Federal Government. I'd be happy to provide you that list.
That would be terrific. I would like to be able to have that list as well. Is there a need as well? You were able to reach into all these different agencies and to be able to research them in a way that most people cannot. What would you perceive as the need for individuals to be able to reach in and be able to search the data so the agencies can get out their employment, their strategies, their program philosophies, to be able to go through data and to be able to actually search it, not just a PDF on some website, but actual searchable data? Is there a need for that, and is that possible to pull off?
There's definitely a need for it. There's not enough of it, and it is possible to pull off.
Okay. That's one of the areas I look at and say you have the opportunity to be able to do that, but there are lots of people at home that would like to be able to search that and research that, whether they be journalists, whether they be individuals, and that is something I would like to see us continue to push on as a committee. I know it's been talked about before, and to continue to find ways to be able to push and do that. And one last thought on it, sunsetting programs. Is there a particular plan that you've seen to say this is a great way to sunset these things out?
I think there needs to be regular reauthorizations of programs. There are too many programs that are created that don't have a regular review and process in place. I do think the Federal Government needs to invest more in regular program evaluations. One of the things we find, and we talk about in here, is a lot of these programs have been operating for years, and there's really not a lot of empirical evidence of what the returns are and whether they're being effective. So I think the Federal Government has, in the past, shortchanged the program evaluation, and I think it needs to be more put in place on a regular basis.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize